Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Lawrence. I'm a professor in... Am I okay for Mike? Yep. I'm a professor in strategy here at the Said Business School. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2023 Clarendon Lecture Series in Management Studies. Just to give you some background, the Clarendon Lectures in Management Studies are jointly organized by Oxford University Press and the Business School. They provide a really distinctive opportunity for us to invite leading international academics to talk on issues broadly related to management, education, and research. They also form the basis for a book to be published subsequently by Oxford University Press, and so they're a distinctive, really unique part of the relationship between the press and the school. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to say thanks to a couple people who have worked hard to put together this event. I want to thank Oxford University Press, and especially Commissioning Editor for Business Economics, Adam Swallow. Without the support of the press and of Adam, this event wouldn't happen, this series wouldn't happen. From the Business School, I'd like to thank a number of people, Tiffany Franklin, Diana Delamere, and Amber Woodhouse, as well as my colleague and partner in this process, Professor Daniel Armanios. I'd also like to recognize and thank Andy Fischhoff for supporting this event, and particularly the logistics in getting both of you here today, which were not trivial. The Clarendon Lecture Series are a really special event in the calendar of the Business School. We host a lot of research and seminars and talks throughout the year, but the Clarendon Lectures are where we have a distinctive opportunity to hear a truly eminent scholar expand on their ideas over a series of 3 lectures. The format of the lectures allows these eminent scholars to address bigger questions than can usually be touched on or dealt with in the confines of a single kind of traditional research talk over an hour and a half. And so I encourage you, thank you for coming tonight, I encourage you to come for all 3 nights if you can, because in a lot of ways they form a conversation across all 3 nights, and to the degree that you can come and participate in that, I think it will really energize the conversation a lot. Today we're very privileged to have presenting the Clarendon Lectures a truly outstanding scholar who's made major contributions to a wide range of scholarly domains. Professor Baruch Fischhoff is the Howard Hines University Professor in the Institute for Politics and Strategy and the Department of Engineering and Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Professor Fischhoff holds a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and Psychology from Wayne State University and a PhD in Psychology from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and of the National Academy of Medicine. He's past president of both the Society for Judgment and Decision Making and the Society for Risk Analysis. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, the Society for Experimental Psychologists, and the Society for Risk Analysis. So I could just go on and on and on about the accolades. But I want to say that looking at Professor Fischhoff's Google Scholar page is an exercise in humility. He's published immensely influential articles across a number of areas, including risk perception, communication and assessment, also the areas of judgment and decision-making competence, and biases and heuristics, where he's done completely foundational work. But as you'll come to see this afternoon, Professor Fischhoff is not only an outstanding intellectual, but someone deeply concerned with practical real-world impacts of science. Just to give you some examples of his recent research, he's examined issues such as diagnostic error in trauma triage, opening movie studios following the COVID-19 shutdown, self-tests for infectious diseases, number of papers on maternal health, public responses to the Ebola crisis, and to me, it's fascinating, the ability of people to detect fake social media personas. And so, as you can see, an incredibly wide range and really sort of fundamentally important issues. He's a rare breed in university life. He's made immense theoretical and conceptual contributions to the disciplines in which he works, at the same time investing in really, sort of truly important practical issues. So, like I say, I could go on, but you're not here to hear me speak. With that, I'd just like to introduce and thank Professor Baruch Fischhoff for being here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. So let me thank all the people that Tom thanked, and Tom as well, the people who are joining us remotely, and Faye Maria, who will be doing caricatures of the event. And thank you all for coming. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to reflect at some length on an issue that's troubled me really for my entire professional life, as well as my pre-professional life. Much of it was devoted to doubting the value of our collective enterprise. And yeah. Pardon? Is this coming out of my time? Oh, thank you. Okay. Yes. Okay. No, what? It's working. Yes. Okay. All right. And we're off. Okay. Well, thank you all again. So, what I've been concerned about much of my no, maybe we're not.
I can hold it behind you, I think.
This is academic legerdemain. So, okay. All right. So the issue that's concerned me is how do we make disciplinary science, which is what most of us do in one way or another, more useful? And the three lectures I was saying, well, first, how do our disciplines help and hinder us? Second, who gave us the right to judge others' competence, which is which we do often do, and who gave us the right to desist when we think we know what might be better? And finally, how do our institutions help and hinder us? So I'm going to have illustrated with more or less happy examples from decision science, which is the field with which I most identify, one of the management science disciplines. So I'll start this lecture with a motivating example. I'll talk about a success, which is a committee on the equitable allocation of vaccine. I'll talk about a long-standing failure, which is to influence climate change, and then talk about our science, which is one of the management sciences. So first, the motivating puzzle. So the world is awash with complex problems where we would often like to be useful, but we're often slow to respond. We're not always asked to help in places where we think we might be useful. We're not always the best helpers when we try. We're not always attractive to recruits. People who finish our PhD programs could be great academics, but decide that there are higher callings, and we're not always liked either in the general or the specific. So one way to think about this is my late colleague Herb Simon talked about two ways of dealing with complex issues. One, in simplified terms, he said there's bounded rationality. We try to be rational about some subset of a decision-making problem and ignore the rest. Second is satisfying, which is to consider everything but accept suboptimal solutions. And the execution of all of these depends on heuristics, which is the basis of his work in artificial intelligence, administrative behavior, and other things. So his idea of heuristics, he didn't invent it. One of the influences was Georg Polya's work on solving mathematical problems. Herb's wonderful colleague Alan Newell talked about it in AI. I once found this reference in Mrs. Burns' Dictionary of Unusual, Obscure, and Preposterous Words, one of which was heuristic. One way I will think about it is that the sciences choose bounded rationality, with each discipline has its own kind of rationality, whereas the humanities and arts choose satisficing. So I know quite a bit about one science, but not about others. Just as to acknowledge something that I monitor to give a feeling of the limits to my knowledge is this wonderful series that our daughter Maya edits for the Network on Business Sustainability, monthly curated selection of things that you'd like to know about in management science. I can say almost nothing about the humanities. I feel like we should be owing them a much greater debt than we do. But I did have a colleague, Gail Rogers wrote this wonderful book on speculation, a take on risk that's perhaps missing from the social sciences, and he edited a special issue on risk of Critical Quarterly and asked me to see what I could write. So I wrote this. This is all I have to say about the humanities. So what are our heuristics in these in our disciplines? So here's three that I took away from my mentor, Amos Tversky. He Amos sadly passed away quite a while ago, so these are just attributed. I hope that he would agree with these, and I hope he would agree that I've done the best I could at fulfilling them. So one is have heuristics that are clear enough to be wrong and be willing to admit it. The second is want to get it right. And the third is to protect the time to think. I would add a fourth of my own, which would be wonder whether you're part of the problem. Yes. So let me talk. So what does this mean in practice? So here I'm going to talk about two attempts to make our science useful. So I've had the opportunity, honored to be a member of about 40 committees of our National Academy of Sciences. One started in late June, early July of 2020 was on the equitable allocation of vaccine. The heads of NIH and CDC, both of whom doubted that they would be trusted in this enterprise, asked the National Academy to come up with a scheme that CDC, NIH, could advocate. The actual allocation is heavily decentralized in the United States. We had a fantastic committee led by Bill Foege, by some accounts, the most successful CDC head ever, one of the leaders in the eradication of smallpox. Helene Gale, currently the president of Spelman College, a remarkably diverse committee by ethnic, by personal and professional background. One of the commitments that the committee made was to ensure that the framework is equitable and is seen as equitable. So we came up with a scheme, wanted to come up with a scheme that would be easily understood by diverse audiences, be readily translated into operational terms, and distinguish scientific and ethical judgments. So we came up with a very simple, auditable, transparent set of risk criteria. So there's some influence of decision science here. We said people should be in high-risk groups to the extent that this characterizes them. So that led, applying these criteria, led us to these priority sets. So if you look at it, terrible contrast, but if you look, you'll see that in the second group, towards the bottom of the second group, you see communities that might well be ignored otherwise. The homeless, people in carceral institutions, people who would be historically subject to health inequities, but we didn't try to, the committee decided not to try to rectify those inequities as a goal in itself, but to make certain that they weren't perpetuated. And we think that there was some political savvy in saying this was a better way of getting attention to people, to getting the people the attention that they deserve. The committee had a strong commitment to communication with two very distinct activities. One, risk communication and community engagement, which is to get people the facts they need to judge, make their own decisions, and to judge the policies that somebody is making on their behalf. And separately, health promotion, which is to try to get people to do what the experts want, with a strong statement the two had to be completely separated, that you contaminate your attempt to inform people if you try to spin the facts, and people don't trust the facts if they're embedded in persuasive messages. And we said that there needed to be a combination of a top-down and a bottom-up system to administer this program. The top-down would be somebody needs to gather and analyze the facts with the kind of expertise that you'll have in a room like this. But then the delivery of the facts needs to be delivered. The facts need to be delivered by people who are in tune with the communities, who have their credibility, who have long-standing relationships with them, and there needs to be two-way communication so that the management is told what are the concerns in the street and gathers information that is relevant to people. This was, by and large, the approach adopted in our decentralized system. So what did it work? Why did this seem to work? There was diverse membership, both by personal and professional background. There was inclusive leadership. We had leaders who could manage the process so people felt respected, as well as understand what people were saying, so they could actually be views could be respected. There were enough interlocking, enduring personal relationships so that people didn't feel as though the project was being hijacked by other people for their own goals. We had this designed for transparency. We were dealing with agencies that had absorptive capacity in the sense that they had people who could act on these and whether these were community-based organizations or the National Institutes. And this was a collective effort. Some of us academics had papers in the future, but we were willing to I guess, suppress our professional egos for the sake of making this happen, and if need be, advocate the science of other people in our fields if it were more relevant. So I think it felt like this was a success. And here's a long-standing failure and painful, tragic one if you think we could have made a difference. So late in the Carter administration, the U.S. Department of Energy contract with the American Association for the Advancement of Science to develop a 20-year planning program for research on CO2-induced climatic change. 1979. There were 5 working groups: the environmental effects on the oceans, cryosphere, and ocean biota, environmental effects on the less managed biosphere and on the managed biosphere, with a recognition that there's nothing untouched by humans, social and institutional responses, and issues associated with analysis of economic and geopolitical consequences. So 2 of the 5 working groups, 40% of the attention was to our issues. My working group had this fantastic, it was led by Elise Boulding, who was one of the first people to do sociology of women. Steve Schneider, who'll be known by everybody, amazing person in the climate change. Remarkably, 30 years later, 2 people on the committee, Bob Chen and I, had sons, Ilya and Bryce respectively, who worked on the 3rd U.S. National Climate Assessment. Anyways, we were real good. The committee chose to have a sociologist, really kind of an all-purpose political scientist, social scientist from Iceland, Haraldur Olafsson, who's still active, speak because he had unique knowledge of the collapse of was an expert among other things, in the collapse of the European civilization in Greenland during the Little Ice Age, so that was really relevant. But they also wanted to make the point that the European societies were vulnerable to climate change. We had a fantastic statement. I think, just to date this, I think this was printed with a daisy wheel printer, which a few of you may recognize. Might be dot matrix, but I think it was daisy wheel. I think it still reads well today, and at the end it said, "The problem calls for an unprecedented interdisciplinary effort." Seemed like things were rolling. We met in this hotel in Annapolis, Maryland. The international organization then was called the Global Atmospheric Research Program. There was a bookstore around the corner from this whose window was full of this book, which coincidentally came out. So, like from our lips to John Irving's ears, that we should do it. I wrote, I think, the first paper on the psychology of climate change. I thought these were the topics. What's worth knowing? What are the properties of the information? How well can we convey that evidence? What is our place in the political process? That is our place, the disciplinary scientist. And what is our place in the politics of science? One of the early issues of climatic change was a special issue that Lita Furbia is a developmental cross-cultural psychologist, and I wrote up this chapter, and nothing happened. The Reagan administration pulled the plug on the 20-year program. The geoscientists and the modelers, they still had enough budget stream to keep their programs alive. When the faucets came back on, observational scientists and modelers never can have enough money. You always can use more data, and you can always do more model runs. We didn't have a place at the table, and nothing happened, I'd say, roughly for a quarter of a century in terms of the social sciences and climate change, during which time who filled the vacuum. Not that things couldn't be done with the science that we had available. Willard Kempton, an anthropologist, and his colleagues wrote this fantastic multi-method approach. We did a couple of studies in the early 1990s using mental models to try to say, well, how do you explain the reality of climate change, which has some unintuitive properties. really nothing happened. The Obama administration thought better, and among other initiatives, was making a lot of data available online. But since there had been no science in the interim, there was really no expertise in making making the data available. So if you went to data, as I did, you went to data.gov, you find an uncurated set of 194,861 data sets. And if you look down below, I can't quite read it here, but there's like 700 on climate. And how are you to know? How do you define yourself? How do you know what's worthwhile? The Economic Rescue Act that the Obama administration pushed through had quite a bit of money for energy conservation, for things like smart meters. We were part of a project, one of the big U.S. utilities. So it turned out, so what do you do when you get into a new area? You read the literature. So my colleagues, particularly Alex Davis and Tamar Krishnamurti and Wendy Brun de Bruin, found about 30 published, or actually 30 unpublished reports in the gray literature of things like putting smart meters in people's homes or monitors. And they look, Alex and Tamar looked at this more closely. They just felt the quality was terrible. Well, it's not surprising there was no expertise in this area. They're well-meaning people who did it without expertise. Alex had the insight of applying the analysis, the risk of bias approaches that the Cochrane collaboration has developed for medical clinical trials to these behavioral field trials. This is the result from our paper from about 10 years ago. The colors tell the story. Here's here are six major causes of sources of bias as found in medical clinical trials. Where there's yellow, the science, well, you didn't know what people did because they didn't report it. You don't know if they control for this bias or not, because something pre-paradigmatic, pre-discipline, people don't know what's important. And where they had reported, they typically they typically had not controlled for a bias. Our conclusion was that we had learned nothing from all of this effort, and we had the opportunity costs had the direct costs of given the stakes, money wasted on these studies is no big deal, but the opportunity cost of imagining that you're addressing a problem, you're checking a box for useless studies, not so good. There are a few people who. This is not a complete set, who are managing to address this in a way that bridges the practical and the academic world. Interestingly, they're not well engaged with academic institutions. Two of them. So one of them is the Climate Collection in Climate Connection, which does fantastic work on attitudes and perceptions at Yale. Second is Climate Central, which is a fantastic database of and pretty usable displays on things like sea level rise. They're both at universities, but not actually part of the university, to the best of my understanding. And the third is the Climate Advocacy Lab, which is engaged with the communities, but not doing academic research. So we have two groups that are doing effective academic research, not quite engaged with the communities because it's not quite in their mission, and one that could not find. We work with these are wonderful people. They're my friends, but it reflects the challenge of bringing these worlds together. So, what happened here? Well, what happened in this thing? Well, we had diverse people. We had somewhat inclusive leadership like Steve Schneider and Elise Boulding. There were some enduring relationships, but not going very long, mostly within the academic community, not much with the user community. We published everything. The design wasn't all that transparent. If you follow the climate modeling, it's opaque even to some of the modelers. The agencies didn't have absorptive capacity. There's nobody in these agencies who knows social science, so why would they? How would they know to ask for it, and how would they know that they're getting quality process? And I can't say that there's been a collective effort. There's lots of people committed, but there's not really an integrated community of people working on these things across together in a way that would change their disciplines as a result of this engagement. So Decision science, we tried to play some role in both of these. What do we do? And I'll have other examples in this talk and the others mainly from it. So this is what we do. Decision science, we analyze decisions, begin with some kind of a formal analysis. We do descriptive research to find out how people actually make decisions. And then we try to invent interventions that would help people to make better decisions. It's inevitably an iterative process. We either don't understand the people or don't understand the decisions well enough to be helpful, and sometimes you always need to iterate it. This is in some ways our founding document. Ward Edwards, Harold Limon, and Jimmy Savage translated Bayesian inference into terms that psychologists could use. I still have Amos Tversky's copy, so this is one of my prized possession. Worth reading. And so what do we do given this Bayesian framing? So during the 1960s, the first behavioral research involved tasks like these. So you have an urn with one of these two distributions of red and black poker chips, and I draw samples of poker chips, and you have to give me the probability that I'm from one urn or the other, or decide when you're willing to make your guess at the urn. So pretty abstract, but if you're an experimentalist, it's not hard for you to tell a story whereby different presentations of the prior odds, differently diagnostic samples, different decision criteria mimic parts of the real world. And fantastic, well-designed studies, but really a hermetically sealed research. There was no way for anything to come in. There was this fantastic paper review that Paul Slovic and Sarah Lichtenstein did in 1971 of this literature, and it's there are seminal papers. This is a terminal paper. It basically ended the field because there were accumulating anomalies that there was just no way that you could stretch the boundaries of the kind of strict Bayesian modeling of decision-making process to accommodate them. And they pointed to heuristics as a way out. In some ways, this was 1971, so it was actually it was concurrent with Tversky and Kahneman's work on heuristics, all drawing from the same notion that we need to think about how people actually make decisions. For those who are unfamiliar with this, here's a typical heuristic, which is availability, judge the probability or frequency of an event by how easily examples come to mind and one can imagine it happening. This turns out to be a great place to start because there's lots of psychology on how people record frequency. Here's one of the first studies. They did things like ask people to name quadruped mammals and write them down as fast as you could and put a dash after every 2 minutes. They did they show how fast people produce them. Turns out to be quite orderly. The top one is for college friends, and the bottom one is for animals with names of 2 or more digits. They have the same shape. It looks predictable. This is they claim the first mathematical formula in psychology. It's a fantastic paper because they say, well, this thing that psychologists worry about, writing slows people down. What if you have people talk and the experimenter will type on a telegraphic key on a chymograph and record, and you get the same shape, although the parameters are a little bit different. So we said, all right, so what if people were interested in risk? Could you do this in risk? So I'll go through this very quickly, but just give you an idea of the kind of, every field has its own attention to detail. These are the things that bother us. So we want to know whether people could judge lethal events. Well, you want to have events that people understand and a correct answer, and ask people about a unit that they understand. So we found 41 causes of death with good public health statistics. We said, well, one way to ask people judgment is how many people die from each cause. Well, when you do that, you get what? People have no idea what numbers to give. So, we had most of the causes of death. If you add them somebody else, most of them, the life expectancy in the U.S. is 8 years, and up for other people it was 8,000 years. So we said, all right, well, let's give people a number. Let's give people an anchor. So here are the two anchors that we give. From causes of death, we thought the people had a rough idea. We said, I put in accidental here. The death penalty wasn't legal in the U.S. at that time, so we didn't have to specify that. We knew that anchoring affects people's judgment. So we're introducing one bias in order to reduce another bias, and we got the bias we expected. People who told about motor vehicle accidents, these are the true frequency with their estimates, gave higher numbers than others, and both curves were flat, as you would expect, because everything is pulled towards the number that you give people. We said, well, do we trust the number? Because lots of people claim that people are innumerate, so we asked the same question in a somewhat different way, gave people pairs, asked people which of these is more likely, what's the ratio of the two, and turns out to be pretty consistent. We said, well, we really believe in availability. Are we getting bias in these estimates that you would expect if people made judgments by availability? Yep. Paul Slovic and Barbara Combs checked newspapers, counted in newspapers, New Bedford and I forget the paper, and the Eugene Register Guard. This is pre-Google. You actually had to count the obituaries and so on, and found that was there. We said, well, how robust are these numbers? If you tell people to avoid the bias, can they avoid it? Nah. We said, well, maybe, is this anomaly about words? So we did the same study with anomaly. Is this just specific to causes of death? So we did the same study with words and occupations. And our test of whether we had captured people's beliefs was what we call construct validity. We say, and we thought it would look pretty good. The estimates were sensitive to the anchors, right? It should be if they're know what they're talking. If we're getting numbers, they were sensitive to availability. We got similar ordering with direct estimates and paired comparison. Similar patterns with frequency estimates for causes of death, words, and occupations. So we felt, okay, we could do this science. So these are old studies, but these are the kinds of studies that psychologists do. So what was good and bad about them and similar studies? So it was a move towards realism. We asked about things in the real world, not just things presented in experiments. We developed clear evaluative standard. There's lots of people who, I'll talk about that tomorrow, lots of people who claim that other people are biased without rigorous standards. This is a multi-method research. Negative, our major result, that flat curve, was misinterpreted. It's been widely cited as saying that people overestimate small risks and underestimate large risks. We say very clearly in the paper, this is a reflection of anchoring. The way we asked the question led to this bias, and it's out there, and you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Second, I think that this paper is probably cited more than it's read, which is good for your ego and not particularly good for the world, because it has details like that in it. And that we have this really Sarah Lichtenstein's work. We had this multi-method approach that nobody else has done. I'm not sure I would have done it I'm actually pretty sure I wouldn't have done it without Sarah's prodding and gift for methodology and desire to get it right. So some good, some bad. All right, so where does this kind of work get us? So here are three kinds of phenomena that I think characterize our work, but I would ask people in other disciplines to reflect on whether they have similar experiences. So the first, we have some insights internal to our world, the things that we didn't know going into it. So one is we find that simple models can predict complex processes. Quite relevant to algorithmic stuff today, not known to the best of my knowledge by people who study algorithms. You can have great prediction with absolutely no relationship to the underlying decision-making process. Great if you're interested in accuracy, not particularly great if you're interested in wisdom or learning. Second, we learned that biases can persist because they have little impact. That is, so Ward Edwards and Detlef have what they call the flat maximum theory, showing that many decisions with continuous outcomes are actually insensitive to errors in their parameters, whether it's utilities or probabilities. So Ward's, who's never a great fan of the heuristics and biases work, thought we overemphasize the biases. The flip side of that is, well, if the world is really tolerant of a lot of sloppy vague probability or even probability estimates, it means you don't have those opportunities to learn, which might make you vulnerable in other situations. Third, that we learned that communicating incentives is very difficult. You want people to get almost everything right in a task. Well, I could get everything right if I made a speed accuracy trade-off that really slowed things down. In the early days of research, there were attempts, I think there's people still doing this, to use proper scoring rules as a way to motivate people to give true probability estimates, but they're really hard to understand, and they end up suppressing expressions of great confidence. Something I think is not understood. So that's something else that we learned. These are in the slides in case somebody would like to see more detail. Second, we have within any field we have friction. During the book bag and the poker chip experiments, I'll sometimes use the book bag, not an urn. That wasn't controversial. But people tended to get their probability judgments wrong. It was called, people didn't extract enough information from the evidence, and there was an argument about whether this was because they misperceived the value of the evidence or they misaggregated the evidence. You could think they have different. If you can't combine, somebody could combine for you. If you can't perceive, then you're in trouble. Very creative work done disseminating that. There are big disputes about whether these frequencies are recoded as types or tokens. That is, do you, every time you see a chinchilla, is there a type in your memory of the chinchilla type that you strengthen, or is there a separate representation of each chinchilla that you've seen? And it makes a big difference if you study of memory. There's a big dispute, about whether people think in terms of probabilities or frequency. Very intense internally. You could decide how important it is externally. Disputes about whether you can interact with people or what I call passive assessment, that I ping you with a question and just get your response and pretend that this is not actually a dialogue between us. The impassive people are still way ahead. And finally, there's interdisciplinary friction over things like methodological norms, the value of intrinsic and extrinsic incentives. These are primarily disputes between psychology and economists, whether you could look at, you should only look at revealed preferences as actual behavior or expressed preferences, with economists sometimes dismiss as cheap talk. This seemed like an area where there could have been some mutual reinforcement. And one of the very earliest adopters, this is a American Economics Review paper by Dave Grether and Charlie Platt, I think from 1979, who were trying to understand the preference reversal anomaly that Paul and Sarah had documented. And they said it showed a kind of irrationality from an rational actor perspective that could not be accommodated by any natural, and you couldn't accommodate by economic theory. And they said, well, here are all of the different things that might have influenced it, including people knowing that psychologists were thinking, oh, psychologists, they're always trying to trick us or trip us up. And this was an olive branch from economics of saying, this is our attempt to understand your world. And it's my sense that economics has chosen to reinvent its own version of experimental science, which sees things that psychologists can't see, but doesn't know things like the Boesfield and Sedgwick work on memory processes. And we're at fault, they're at fault. But here's a place where you have two groups collecting evidence that don't always respect one another. So, the bottom line. So this is my balance sheet for decision science. Our assets are that we have this analytical clarity within our bounds of having well-defined tasks and standards. We have behavioral realism, again, within the bounds of the kind of evidence that we create, of trying to not rely on our intuitions about people, but actually to find out what their behavior. We have potentially useful results if we had the relationships that are needed with people who need them, but don't always have those incentives to create the kind of sustained relationships with people in the outside world, that they should trust us, that we're working with them, and if things don't work out, we'll be there with them. And then we have this liability, so we are at a remove for policy making. You would not be rewarded in most places for building trusted relationships, learning somebody's culture, being there to mop up if things didn't work out. We have, true to our discipline, we have this cognitive framing, looking at how individuals make decisions, which is asocial in the sense of not being related to culture or social pressure, and so on. If we collaborated with other people, they might help us to get out of this or to create joint products, but that is a limit to our work. And then finally, we have this evaluative stance towards others, right? So we have this analysis that is a putative, that's our foundation, putative argument for how decisions should be made, and rhetorically, conceptually, anything that doesn't look right, any behavior that doesn't meet that standard, which we have defined, puts people at a disadvantage and puts us at an advantage of being the people who know the right answers. So that's what I want to talk about tomorrow evening. Particularly the other things in the summary, kind of lost opportunities. Yeah, we have useful work. Maybe it didn't go as well as it could. Here with this. With the evaluative stance of our science is one where I think we're doing actual damage, or I think we're actually part of the problem. So I've called the talk Unbounded Respect, which would be an aspiration, which would be fair assessment of decision makers' competence, because I believe that these assessments that we do are bounded by our lack of self-reflection of our discipline and the limits to what we're capable of doing, and what the kind of stories you can get through journals and sort of things that are rewarded professionally. So how do our performance, self-awareness, and disclosure practices affect others? So I hope you found this interesting, and we'll come back tomorrow, and I really welcome your input, because I said I've been worrying about these things most of my pre-professional career, and recognize that I guess the theme here is that none of us has I certainly don't have a monopoly on insight, so thank you.
Thanks very much. So we have time for questions about 15 plus minutes or so, and because we started a little late, so we're not going to kind of penalize everyone for that. I'm going to take the questions. I'm also taking questions from online. So if you want to ask a question, look at me, and then Baruch will just answer questions. So yeah, Tyson, go ahead. And there's 2 mics, I think, heading around. So the next person was. Great.
Thank you so much, Professor Fischhoff. It's wonderful here the whole story of decision science, and you talk about the founding, and you talk about a revolution that took place within this. I'm wondering if you have a reflection on the counterfactual, or what if we hadn't gone this route, founded this discipline? Would other areas of psychology gone with different explanations of these phenomena that were more traditional? And when and how do we need new disciplines and get new disciplines?
Yeah. Oh, it's really interesting. I did my dissertation on hindsight bias, so anybody I should avoid chanting an answer. So I think there was a unique moment. I'll talk a bit about it in the third lecture, where you had people like at the University of Michigan and a couple of other places who had the analytical skills as Ward and Harold and Jimmy did, to translate Von Neumann and Morgenstern and all of the analytical work into terms that you could make behavior with, and had enough interest in behavior to see whether these were realistic models. And Michigan at that time had a mathematical psychology program where you sort of got a master's in mathematics at the same time you got a PhD. It was largely working on psychometric scaling, people like Clyde Coombs and others, but there was a meeting there where you had people with mathematical skills and behavioral interests. There was also a time that there was some interest in applications, and I think that the hardest thing that the field has in sustaining itself intellectually is finding people with the analytical skills. So I mean, all psychologists are well trained in statistics. They know their limits. They know how to talk to somebody who knows even more. But the people who can do the kind of broad-based, model, to find the model that is suited. Is this a queuing model that people are trying to understand? Is it operations research? Is it, do I need an influence diagram? Those people are really rare. And I think the limit, I think our progress as a field is limited by the rarity of those people. It's not trained in psychology departments, and it's not, the people who do the modeling typically don't know behavior. I think you have to, both fields know so much, they have to work together, because you can't do behavioral work to a modern standard unless you've actually, gone through the apprenticeship. So I think if it hadn't been the chance of those people coming together, I don't know that the field would have existed. And Donnie and Amos Tversky and Kahneman had this intellectual ability and fortitude and determination to get an audience with economics, which has done, some things I don't like, but some very creative things that we couldn't have done.
Very much for the enlightening lecture. So I like your question about knowing our place in the political process. So a lot of our scholarly efforts nowadays, if we want to generate a real-world impact, that requires in-depth understanding and sometimes also engagement with the policy-making process of political leaders. So my question is, are the decision science insights between research on political leaders and research on business leaders interchangeable? So we can use what we developed in the business literature to help political leaders make better decisions and policies that impact business and society.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That is the big question. So I almost only work on public sector. So I don't know, and I would say when the field grew, when it took off in the 1970s and 1980s, psychology departments were and business and policy school were very slow to adopt it. So our most talented PhD students went to work in business schools. So you'd have to ask them what they think about it. So to some extent, Paul Slovic, Sarah Lichtenstein, and I, very few people were interested in public policy, sort of had the field to ourselves, which is in some ways fantastic, because had lots of opportunities to do things. We were also fortunate in that we were not in a disciplinary department. Paul, Sarah, and I worked at decision research, a little boutique research institute. I came to CMU in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy. And engineers require collaborative work. And as long as we could continue to turn out the papers, we could spend the time that was needed to understand the policy environment. So I said, I've been on 40 of our National Academy of Sciences committees, which are all collaborative work. Some of them not all as successful as the one on vaccine equity. And as those of you who studied networking and social processes, there's no substitute for knowing people, seeing their reality, and for trusting you that you'll be there through thick or thin. And that will be a big topic of my third talk. How do you create an incentive system how do you create institutions that reward that kind of collaboration? What was I mentioning? I was mentioning maybe to Tom. When I moved to came to Carnegie Mellon, it was 35 years ago, we had a very small endowment, still have a pretty small endowment relative to our competitors, and that's why it was so small. And somebody said, oh, it's because we trained the people who make America run, not the people who run America. So if we focus, and if we focus on technical skills of execution, then we have the people absolutely vital for making the economy, businesses, markets run. But those are not the people who are engaging in these larger scale policy questions or asking about what are the blind spots of our risk or econometric or other models. So we won't be running the world. We might be helping the world to run. But you do need to reward people for spending that task that can often feel like a waste of time, and you can't tell what they're doing. They have 3 less papers a year because they've been spending time talking to a community. So it's not trivial to create those incentives, but I think they're really essential for us to have anything worth saying about the bigger issues.
Thank you. Yeah, just one little point. You said that the climate change program, let's say in relation to the decision theory, you listed that as a failure, but I didn't quite catch how you thought it was a failure. What aspect of climate change comes down as a failure?
Yeah. So I 1980, it looked like we were going to have collaborative work, build joint projects, joint conversations between climate scientists and social scientists that would help to make it clear to the public what was coming down, to help people to recognize it, to understand the social, political, economic forces that were at risk there, and there just was no social science. There was none of that. It was all technical climate science, done with great precision and dedication, but with the expectation that the science would speak for itself when the scientists were ready to share it, and that gap was filled by people who saw the threat posed by belief in climate change and brought out an alternative narrative. And so I think had there been more social behavioral decision science, then the public would have been more aware. We've had a more vigorous political debate. We would be we would have been started planning for managed retreat in the 1980s rather than in the 2010s. And we're still, not as engaged as we might be, although there are a lot of people who are really concerned about this.
Okay.
So my question is about, one of the things that you get from looking at decision sciences is the clarity and kind of neatness of conceptualization. And how do you kind of reconcile the clarity of the decision sciences with the messiness of the organizational sciences? Because this is a place where you can get, maybe college students or people who live around the university to come and sit for experiments and get clear data on people. But in organizations out there in the world, you really struggle to get evidence of this quality, or even clearly formed conceptual statements that can be checked for seem to be missing or very hard to get at.
Yeah. So that was I had a bullet on that. When if I could go back. Anyways, I can't go backwards. Anyways, I guess that's a good sign. Yeah. So we don't do that, and we can't do that. We're not trained to do that. If we try to do that, then we do it badly. I see a lot of people who are doing studies of a type, and they've swapped out climate for they swapped out something prejudice for HIV, and then they swapped out HIV for pandemic disease, and it's basically the same science without challenging its discipline. It's done with great fidelity, it enriches the science, but you haven't really understood the phenomenon, you haven't really engaged the people. And we can't do it alone, and we're dangerous if we do it alone. I'll talk about this tomorrow, one of the dangerous things that I think we run into is people who treat the world as an experiment. To say, okay, I'm going to do this kind of manipulation in the lab, and who's going to let me do this manipulation in their community? Can I get them to change their behavior or change their beliefs without the participation, the precautions, the ethical standards of doing that? It's, it can be unethical, but it's also doesn't advance the science because we haven't done the kind of stretch that you're talking about of saying, how do we do this? I'll also talk about this. I think tomorrow I do work with people in critical care medicine, and they worry about things like how do you involve patients in making a decision about the care of somebody who's non-responsive after cardiac arrest, or for somebody who's got chronic critical illness. How do you engage the community, the person to the extent that they're able, or their surrogates or caregivers, in deciding there should be a change in standards of care? I've worked with a neonatologist who's been worrying, how do you help parents make care decisions about extremely premature infants? And I have something, I like to believe I have something to contribute to these relationships by helping them to just organize the mess that's in your head. How do you structure these decisions? How do you talk about these probabilities? How do you talk about probabilities when people are not ready to talk about probabilities? So it's those issues. I like to think that that I'm providing a piece of the puzzle for them, so they can get a little further into these decisions before you have to go on your gut, your religion, or whatever. So I think those are the kind of collaborations I think are so, they're rewarding. They push our science, but require us to realize we're just a piece of the puzzle.
Okay. Question in the back.
Thank you. You touched on the trade-off between accuracy and the wisdom, and I think it's related to one of the challenges in AI about explainability versus accuracy, where we have these black box models, which are really which are really sophisticated, but at the same time you can't understand their decision. I'm wondering if you have some insights or reflection on how this decision science might apply to learning these powerful AI models, which are increasingly becoming part of our everyday decision making.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. So first thing would be for the AI people to collaborate with people who know behavioral research rather than to imagine what behavior is. So you have people developing explainable models, but it's a technical definition of explanation, not a human definition of explanation. So I have a student now, paper just went in for revise and resubmit, Dick Dunning, who's trying to understand, his project is how people learn from, how people deal with AI advisors at various levels of ability. And so he's trained models to various levels of ability. And what he finds is, I hope he doesn't mind my stealing his thunder here. Paper hasn't quite been accepted yet. But he finds that people abandon models that below some threshold, and they just dismiss them. They unthinkingly rely on models that are very good but imperfect, so they don't have that kind of supervisory control system ability to be able to monitor how things are going in and step in when the model reaches its limits, which is one of the promises sometimes made by the vendors of AI. But if you have an imperfect model, it keeps you engaged, and they're in the particular experimental environment that he's working, that with an imperfect model where you feel like you have a chance, that people get better. They get better, they understand what the model what model's limits are. Their own guesses before they hear what the model has to say are better because they've learned something from the model. So we don't know how general this is, but I think that is the kind of study that could be mutually beneficial and could produce perhaps a kind of performance metric that people could use.
We have time for one more question, Bridget. There you go.
Thank you for your comments, Professor. Looking at the balance sheet, I'm struck by how even under assets, there's an ambivalence. There's analytical clarity, but within our bounds, behavioral realism, but within our bounds, and only potentially useful results. And so you have told us all of the ways in which decision science should be in conversation with other disciplines. I'm wondering, where do you think there is a need for decision science to shine perhaps more brightly than it is currently, or is there a place where those assets are essential in your view and we can perhaps remove the caveats that you've inserted, but is there a place where more decision science is needed?
So I would say, I don't know whether how this will come up, I would say nobody calls me with a problem that I don't find something to say about. Because I think, but we do have this unusual perspective, this general ability to think about structuring problems, some notion of the wide set of behavioral principles. You know, there are lots of behavioral principles. None of them explain a large percentage of people's behavior. They're studied in great detail, so we know. So somebody who knows psychology broadly, not just decision science, may well know something that somebody outside it doesn't know about, or that somebody who doesn't know this science believes is a matter of folk wisdom, but we have strong evidence that it isn't true. I'll have some examples of that in later talks. So I think I would like to think of that kind of humility of recognizing our bounds, recognizing that in each of those interactions we have a better understanding of those bounds, and if the interaction persists, we have some opportunity to extend it. So still sticking to our core business, which is analyzing, studying behavior, characterizing it, we can have a better science and be more useful.
That's a great place to pause, and this is just a pause rather than an end. But it's a pause until you have a drink in your hand and you can sort of ask questions very directly, Professor Fischhoff, for a few minutes after this, but also a pause until tomorrow night. But before we pause, I just want to say thank you for the immensely interesting, engaging talk, both impressive in terms of its scope, but also in terms of taking us through history that you've lived through of the evolution of an incredibly important set of academic engagements and also practical engagements. So thank you very, very much.
Yeah, well,
thank
you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
And we will, now you're invited to reception, which is either out here or out there, out in the lobby of SBS. So don't leave, and if you have other questions, Brooke will be here until he's not.
Please ask. Okay.
So thank you all. See you out there.